all the planets in the solar system, Earth and Mars, the third and fourth planets from the Sun, are the most similar. But despite the similarities, Mars is essentially like no other planet. It is a unique world. It was an elusive and baffling planet to astronomers for hundreds of years. Through early telescopes, it appeared to be a small red sphere, later estimated to be about half the size of Earth. One of the earliest known representations of the planet, drawn in 1659, indicated markings on the surface, and by the movement of these dark patches across the disk, it was shown that Mars rotated on its axis in a period only a little longer than Earth's, about 24½ hours. It was observed, too, that the tilt of its axis, like the Earth's, exposes its polar regions alternately to the sunlight. Thus, each hemisphere has a summer and winter period. And since Mars orbits the Sun in 687 Earth days, one Martian year in each of its seasons is almost twice as long as Earth's. Later mappings of the planet displayed light and dark regions identified erroneously as continents and oceans. The land masses red as the sandstone districts on Earth, the water a greenish blue. In 1877, an Italian astronomer, Giovanni Schiaparelli, discovered what he called canali, or channels, resembling, he said, the finest threads of a spider's web drawn across the disk. In America, Percival Lowell founded an observatory to study these Martian features. Massive irrigation systems, he called them, designed to carry water from the melting ice caps to the major centers of a dying civilization. Science fiction writers populated the cities with terrible creatures of heroic size, with skills beyond Earthman's dreams. In the 1960s, 3 Mariner spacecraft flew by Mars and photographed about 10% of the surface. Gone were the canals, gone were the cities, gone the brilliant and sinister Martians. The photographs revealed a cratered landscape much like the moon, waterless and apparently hostile to life. But in 1971, the Mariner 9 spacecraft orbited Mars and transmitted more than 7,000 photographs of the planet to Earth. The extensive mapping revealed a new and unexpected world. The southern hemisphere, seen by earlier spacecraft, flattened and gouged by the impact of meteorites. The northern hemisphere, a vast plain with few craters, and rising from the plain, a great dome called Tarsis, topped by giant volcanoes. The plateau that joins the two hemispheres is cut by a vast and deep canyon, and by channels with the characteristic patterns of stream beds on Earth. Some of the channels suggested that water may once have flowed on Mars, and thus life might have evolved and possibly adapted to Mars' changing conditions. And then in 1975, 2 Viking spacecraft were launched, each of which was programmed to land a robot on the Martian surface. One of its principal objectives was to test for the presence or absence of living organisms. A communication system linked the spacecraft to the Mission Control and Computing Center in Pasadena, California. On June 19, 1976, the first Viking arrived in the vicinity of Mars after a year-long journey of more than 400 million miles. Once in orbit, its cameras were turned to a detailed examination of the landing area. Imaging teams on Earth scanned some 800 photographs covering a territory about the size of Texas. The chosen landing site was a flat expanse with a few impact craters, one of the lowest regions on the surface. On July 20th, 1976, flight controllers ordered the lander to separate from the orbiter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, separation. Descent sequencing, we're at mission event word 0, we have VL separation.
Because of Mars' great distance from Earth, the signal traveling at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, took 19 minutes to reach the spacecraft. This necessitated a completely automated system on board for carrying out the landing maneuver. During the lander's descent, its instruments analyzed the properties of the thin Martian atmosphere.
9,000 feet coming up on quarter bar pretty soon.
Good roll attitude hold.
Getting close to quarter bar. Confirm quarter bar. Two loops and a high. Got it. We have quarter bar. Lander confirmed parachute deployed. Recon 1, TM2. Drive sync. UHF minus 105. Format 3 is in sync. All right. Format 3 in sync. Leg deployed. 4,800 feet, 177 feet per second.
Confirm roll maneuver.
Parachute separation. Roger. Minus 105.
0.3 Gs.
2,600 feet, 188 feet per second.
2,600 feet. 2,600 feet.
366 feet, 73 feet per second.
ACS is close to vertical.
Nav is green for touchdown.
ACS is green, 1.5 degrees per second max, 0.2 Gs.
Feet per second.
Touchdown, Win. Fantastic. 16 kilobits confirmed. Yes, we have a touchdown time of 12 hours, 12 minutes, 07.1 seconds.
Job very well done. Outstanding, great navigation, perfect. I'm assuming that we must be sitting right on the X. So that's the smooth area. So everybody just did fabulous and couldn't be more pleased. Thank you.
25 seconds after landing, one of the two cameras was initiated and scanned the first picture of the Martian surface.
About a half an hour later, when it started to come back from the orbiter, and we got the first 7 lines on the TV monitors, you could see gray and white light levels, and we knew there was something there. Look at the beautiful rocks. Fantastic. And all of a sudden, we were looking at the surface of Mars, and it was clear, it wasn't dusty, it was sharp. And when we got to the end of that first picture, with the dust and small pebbles in the footpad, it was just, it was really a miracle.
In an instant, the picture was wiped off the TV monitors, and behind it came the filling in of the second picture, a long panoramic view that covers 300 degrees and extends from the lander to the horizon. It disclosed a sector of the basin called Planitia, covered with sand or dust and littered with rocks. The following day, Viking sent back the first color picture. A fine dust, red or yellow-brown, covers the ground. The sky is a light tint of the same color due to the particles of dust suspended in the air. 45 days after these historic events, Viking 2 landed in an area 4,600 miles northwest of Viking 1's landing site. A vast plain, littered too with rocks resembling those on Earth, produced by volcanic processes or by meteorite impact. While the landers conducted experiments on the surface, the orbiters swinging around the planet measured variations in moisture and temperature and took high-resolution photographs of the Martian terrain. Four and a half billion years ago, the planets were formed from the gas and dust of the solar nebula. In the formation of a planet, heat is released and remains embedded in the growing mass. Because the heat can't escape as rapidly as the mass is growing, a point is reached eventually where the interior melts. On Mars, the heavier material sank toward the center, and the lighter material rose to form a crust at the surface. And this crust contained ice and other condensates. A later stage may have occurred where molten rock intruded into the crust and melted the ice, causing a slurry of water and rock and dust to flow across the surface. Some observers believe that such a process may have been the cause of the major channels which we see on the surface of Mars today. But others believe that in Mars' first billion years, the atmosphere may have been warm and dense enough for rain to fall and for rivers to flow. Gradually, the original thick, wet, and warm blanket of the atmosphere evolved into the thin, dry carbon dioxide atmosphere we find there today. Because of Mars' low atmospheric pressure and low temperatures, water can't exist in liquid form. It must either freeze or evaporate. But while there are no oceans or rivers on Mars, there is more water in total than anyone had expected. The residual polar cap in the north, which remains after the hottest part of the northern summer, is water ice mixed with dust. And the measurements of the seasonal behavior of water vapor over the planet suggest that there is a vast reservoir of ice beneath the surface, so that one can think of the residual polar cap as the tip of an iceberg protruding from a sea of rock. At lower latitudes, the water vapor condenses to form clouds that ride high in the atmosphere or swirl around the slopes of Martian volcanoes. And further south, in the canyons and valleys, there is frequently an ice haze seen to form and evaporate in the early hours of the morning as the sun warms the atmosphere. On Earth, the ocean's heat and moisture and the heat and air currents over land masses interact to produce complex weather patterns. On Mars, because of the absence of large bodies of water and of massive cloud covers, the weather doesn't vary much from day to day. Like a remote weather station on Earth, Viking's meteorology instrument measures Mars' atmospheric pressure, temperature, wind speed, and wind direction. Temperatures range from minus 122 degrees Fahrenheit just after dawn to minus 22 degrees in the mid-afternoon. Light winds from the east in the late afternoon change to light winds from the southwest after midnight. Maximum wind speed is 15 miles per hour. But in the early summer, the heating of dust particles in the air generates violent dust storms in the low regions of the planet. Driven by winds that reach 150 miles an hour, they may blanket the entire planet in a few days.
In order to understand the geology and physics of wind-blown particles on Mars, we're conducting a series of experiments using this enormous space environment chamber here at NASA's Ames Research Center. We've placed an open-circuit wind tunnel in this chamber, and we're able to operate at atmospheric surface pressures comparable to those on Mars. In this particular series of experiments, we have placed a crater model in the tunnel floor, and we want to determine the zones of erosion and deposition around the crater. In this particular case, we're going to let the wind blow across the crater and see what those zones of erosion and deposition are like.
The light and dark streaks associated with craters are the most common features on the surface of Mars related to wind. The light streaks are deposits of fallout from the global dust storms. The dark streaks are regions from which a thin layer of light material has been removed, revealing a darker underlying surface. These streaks serve as wind markers. Their patterns define the wind flow. To the geologist, the features seen in the tens of thousands of photographs transmitted by Viking are the visible signs of the enormous forces and processes that have shaped the surface of Mars. The excavation of large basins and craters by the impact of meteorites and asteroids. The raising of mountains by the action of volcanoes. The faulting and subsidence of the crust as the planet expanded. And the cutting of channels by water, or abrasive particles driven by winds over a period of tens of millions of years. The key to the age and sequence of these features is found in the number and condition of craters. Those areas with fewest craters are assumed to be the youngest. Here, a fresh crater overlies an ancient eroded one. Here, the rim of a crater is eroded by water or wind. And here, adjacent to a fresh crater, is one of a cluster of crater rings, craters that have been buried to varying depths. Over millions of years, the repeated flows of lava built the volcanic mountains of Mars. 12 are larger than any on Earth. The largest, Olympus Mons, rises 3 times higher than Mount Everest and is broad enough to cover the whole chain of volcanoes that form the Hawaiian Islands. The great gash that cuts through Mars' equatorial zone is Valles Marineris, a mighty canyon system that extends over an area more than 3,000 miles long and up to 400 miles wide, and drops 4 miles below the flat cratered surface of the plateau. Canyon walls are gullied, dissected by tributary canyons, or scarred by catastrophic landslides, leaving steep cliffs and great fractured surfaces. Extending for 30 miles on the canyon floor is a field of sand dunes, suggesting that some of the debris produced by the collapse of the canyon walls was removed by wind. These ancient channels that resemble dry riverbeds on Earth could have been formed by primeval rainstorms. But the vast channel systems that start in areas of collapsed terrain, with broad streamlines extending hundreds of miles across the lowlands, and teardrop-shaped islands soaring to thousands of feet above the channel bed, testify to a process without any parallel on Earth. Viking also photographed the 2 cratered moons of Mars, Phobos, the inner moon, marked by striations which, on closer view, resolve into grooves several miles long, and Deimos, the smaller outer moon. Viking, traveling at 3,800 miles an hour and passing only 30 miles away, could observe boulders on the moon's surface, some as large as 100 feet across. The geologic record of the planet suggests that Mars, like the Earth, has experienced periodic changes of climate. The best evidence of this is seen in the strange spiral patterns of Mars' polar regions. The dark bands are scarps or cliffs of bare ground within the North Polar ice cap. On each scarp are numerous small terraces eroded from layered rocks. This is a model of layered terrain, an area about 40 miles across. It is believed that the large scarps and the small terraces represent 2 different cycles of climatic change which occur simultaneously. Because of Mars' oscillation in its orbit about the sun, the polar regions are alternately warm and cold for periods of tens of thousands to millions of years. During the cold period, mixtures of dust and ice were deposited in a series of near horizontal layers, obscuring the underlying topography. Then a period of warmer climate followed, and erosion set in, cutting deep valleys into the icy mass of the polar caps. After the erosion cycle, new layers were laid down, and another episode of erosion followed. This oblique truncating of one set of terraces by another indicates that the climate turns on and off, the first geological evidence for cyclical climatic change on a planet other than the Earth. The speculations about changes in the atmosphere and climate were closely related to the notion that life in some form might exist on Mars. On Earth, life developed several billion years ago, at a time when the overall properties of Mars and the Earth were very similar.
Now, over the ensuing billions of years, Mars and the Earth evolved separately. However, Mars today still has chemicals on its surface, an atmosphere, temperatures and pressures within which we believe life can exist. The Viking lander was equipped with 3 life detection experiments designed to test for chemical changes caused by life processes that are familiar to us on Earth. On Earth, all living organisms interact with the environment through a process called metabolism.
Animals, for example, take oxygen from the environment and use it to combust food, thereby obtaining energy. At the same time, they release carbon dioxide and other waste products into the environment. Green plants and some microorganisms do the reverse in the process of photosynthesis. They remove carbon dioxide from the environment, and using sunlight as the energy source, they convert the carbon dioxide into organic matter and release oxygen into the environment.
If the experiments on Mars indicated that similar processes were occurring, then we would presume the possible existence of organisms on that planet. Well, our results on Mars in certain experiments gave us data that seemed to mimic the metabolism of living organisms. However, careful analysis of that data indicates that it is probably the result of chemical rather than biological processes.
On Earth, all biological systems are based on organic chemistry, and it was believed that life on Mars would also be based on organic compounds. The notion was strengthened when experiments on Earth demonstrated that organic materials can be formed under simulated Martian conditions.
We used finely powdered minerals like those expected on the Martian surface. Then we added traces of water vapor and radioactive carbon monoxide at low pressure. To simulate Martian sunlight, we irradiated the mixture with light from a xenon arc lamp. When we heated the sample and captured the gases that were formed, our radiation counter showed that the carbon monoxide and water had been converted to organic compounds.
But Viking's instruments failed to detect organic compounds of any kind. That fact, in the opinion of some observers, has increased the odds against the existence of living organisms on Mars.
If we were able to do 1,000 experiments, different experiments on Mars, and to do these in a wide variety of places on Mars, in the canyons, on the polar caps, in some deep areas of the surface, and if in all of these experiments we got negative results, then the answer to the question, is there life on Mars, would almost certainly be no. But on the basis of just a few experiments, done at only 2 sites, very bland sites on the planet, I think it would be unscientific for us to come to that conclusion. All we can really say for sure is that we have run across some very interesting chemistry, a kind of chemistry that we do not see in surface samples from the Earth or surface samples from the Moon, and that's about where we are at the moment. Today, in laboratories across the nation, scientists are trying to simulate the results that we obtained on Mars. Some of the scientists are concentrating on irradiation experiments to see whether solar energy acting on Mars could have produced chemicals to account for the results. Other experiments are assuming that these chemicals were there and are testing one or another of these chemicals to see whether they can account for the results that were obtained.
The question of life on Mars is only one of the inexhaustible number of questions for which we continue to seek answers in space. Questions about the origin and evolution of the solar system, of our own planet, and our own species. The search for answers is a goal of planetary exploration, and the journeys of our spacecraft to the near and far reaches of the solar system are beginning to provide some of the answers.
Planet Mars is next to our own, the fourth world counting out from the sun. Barren, perpetually cold, and with a thin atmosphere of poisonous gas. Surely no intelligent life could survive there. The surface of Mars, we now know, is covered with meteor craters, gigantic mountains, and deserts that reach around the entire planet. And one thing more, a giant sculpture that many scientists now speculate was created by some unknown race of intelligent beings. And if it is what it appears to be, what does that have to do with Earth? Mars is our nearest and most reachable galactic neighbor, but for some as yet unexplained reason, trying to study this planet has met with failure after failure. Beginning with 2 attempts by the Soviets in 1960, both missions mysteriously failed.
After the problems the Russians had getting their probes to Mars, American scientists started to joke among themselves about some great galactic ghoul that was preventing our missions from getting there too. In November 1964, the Americans launched the Mariner missions to Mars. But as it approached Mars, Mariner 3's camera shroud failed to open, making the camera useless.
It does indeed seem that missions to Mars have met with an unusually high failure rate. But in July of 1965, the American probe Mariner 4 finally brought success and completed the first flyby of Mars. So had Earth scientists at last outwitted the galactic ghoul? Apparently not. When the Soviets then attempted to actually land a probe on Mars, something astonishing happened.
Everything on the Mars probe seemed to be working perfectly, and then it just shut off.
Could it be that there's something out there that's interfering with Earth's efforts to conquer space? Or is it all just an incredible string of coincidences? Whatever the reason, it was 5 years before the United States made another attempt to reach Mars. But in 1976, the Viking probe began sending volumes of images back to Earth from their orbits above Mars, including these.
Encouraged by the success of the Viking probe, the Soviet Union, with international cooperation, launched a set of satellites in 1988. Phobos 1 never even made it to the planet. At some point it just disappeared.
Phobos 2, the probe that was sent up to look at one of the moons of Mars, apparently encountered something very strange, of which the Soviets had a picture that did surface in the United States.
Of a very massive elliptical shape object.
The NASA individuals here that may know about it, of course, would never make a comment on it.
And then it too disappeared.
And 5 years later, the American space probe Mars Orbiter seems to have met the same fate. But what exactly did happen to them? Many researchers now believe the loss of so many Mars probes cannot be an accident, but a deliberate attack on spacecraft from Earth by something or someone near Mars that does not wish to be photographed. Could this be true? Has this bizarre string of space disasters occurred because we caught a glimpse of something we were not supposed to see? Has the Viking space probe presented us with a mystery that is unsolvable? The mystery first began to unfold in 1976, when the unmanned Viking space probe was going about its highly successful mapping mission of our neighbor planet. When the images that were transmitted back to Earth began to be analyzed, this surface feature in the region designated as Cydonia caught the attention of people all over the Earth.
The initial official reaction from NASA about this photograph is that it was just a trick of chance sunlighting. Certainly no one believed that there was a huge carved face on the surface of Mars. Besides, who could have made such a thing? No one believes in the science fiction version of men on Mars. And we know that Mars is not capable of supporting intelligent life as we know it. So the idea of this being a creation of intelligence was not even considered by NASA. Despite all of this, when the image was first recorded, it was labeled head.
But fortunately, the story doesn't end there. The picture caught the eye of image analysis experts Vince DiPietro and Greg Molinar. DiPietro and Molinar undertook the colossal task of discovering what the strange picture really showed.
At first, they just enlarged the photo and considered there was nothing there at all. So Vincent DiPietro and I designed a computer program to enhance the image in much more detail than NASA had done.
And even though their new process resulted in images as convincing as these, NASA apparently continued to insist that the image was nothing more than a trick of the light. And to prove it, they said that Viking had photographed the same area from a different angle and that there was no face visible in the second photograph.
Then we went through the archives to see if there was any other satellite passes over that same area. NASA said there wasn't at first, and we looked through their archives and found one. And there, just as before, there was a face with a higher sun angle showing more detail than before. And images of the eyes showed pupils, and of the mouth area showed teeth. We were very impressed.
Now there were two photographs of the head. Was this proof the image was built by intelligent beings? Did this second photograph solve the mystery, or was it only the beginning of an even greater puzzle? A puzzle with one of the most important pieces found on Earth. The startling answer. UFO Diaries returns.
These two separate frames, identified by their NASA frame numbers 35A72 and 70A13, also contain considerable detail about the surrounding area, revealing several other images that DiPietro and Molinar found as exciting as the mysterious face.
About 10 miles away from the face is a couple of pyramids, and the strange thing about those pyramids is they're very regular triangular shape. In the corner of each corner there appears to be a buttress, and on close examination the buttress itself is pyramid shaped.
Was this undeniable proof that an intelligent race had once lived on the planet Mars?
This would be really, really remarkable for this to be a natural formation.
Since the time of that discovery, science writer and consultant Richard Hoagland has worked tirelessly to discover the whole truth about the mysterious Cydonia region of Mars.
A member of our team, Dr. Mark Carlotto, decided to use a state-of-the-art 3D computer modeling technique which now strongly indicates that the face could in fact be a real three-dimensional human-looking sculpture, a sculpture 1,500 feet high and over a mile long.
But is it not still possible that these intriguing shapes are really nothing more than accidents of nature? That the researchers who study them are simply letting their imaginations run wild?
Many intriguing questions are raised by the apparent connections between this image from the planet Mars and ancient structures here on Earth. Perhaps the most intriguing being, does this image on the surface of another planet give us important clues to the origins of ancient structures on our world?
Richard Hoagland's study team may have uncovered proof that one of our oldest relics was not built by human hands.
And as I began looking at some references and books and talking with colleagues, this was a sketch done by Shannon, one of our early artists on the team, we both realized that this image was somehow trying to tell us something profound. It was trying to say this.
Could the resemblance between the face at Cydonia and the Sphinx at Giza be more than a mere coincidence?
And if not, does all this prove once and for all that these great monuments were all designed and built by an intelligent race from another world?
Did the Egyptians, in fact, as we know them, do this remarkable structure?
Recent archaeological and geological discoveries demonstrate that the Sphinx is at least 10,000 years old and maybe even older.
That is, the Sphinx appears to be much, much more heavily weathered than we have any right to expect from only, quote, 5,000 years of desert weathering. The kind of weathering we see on the Sphinx is best explained by the action of running water. You need rain to get that degree of erosion, 12 feet of it in some places. And that amount of rain has not fallen in Egypt for at least 10, maybe 15 or 20,000 years. Now that raises a wonderful problem. It means that we're now looking at a monumental work of art created at a time when nobody else on planet Earth is supposedly able to do anything of that magnitude or scale. There's no other contemporary civilization to pin it on. So who did it?
Could these both be ancient sculptures made by the same race of beings? If so, who or what is this face intended to represent? The key to understanding the face on Mars may lie in the fact that the Sphinx of Egypt is a combination of hominid and feline, half man, half lion.
It was at this point that we began to worry less about the ultimate reality of the so-called face on Mars and more about the meaning of the message of Cydonia.
An astonishing discovery when UFO Diaries returns. Hoagland's researchers, in comparing the two images, made an amazing discovery.
Maybe there's a connection. Maybe the face of Cydonia is half man, half something else.
First, they copied the left half of the Cydonia head, made a mirror image of it, and pasted it onto the other side.
That's the Simian half.
The results were interesting, but inconclusive.
Wouldn't it be wild?
However, when they tried the same thing with the right half, flipped it over and matched it up on the left side, the result was a clear image of a lion's head.
Are these merely strange optical illusions, or are they the key to understanding the real truth behind our own past? Surely it's still possible that mere coincidence could be the culprit behind all of these so-called connections between monuments of Earth and the images we've seen from Mars. Or is there any more and better evidence?
In southwest England, the ancient man-made mountain of Silbury Hill has loomed over the horizon since time immemorial. Nearby is Avebury, believed to be a fortress centuries old, tall earthen walls protecting an inner mound. The area also contains an amazing connection to the structures at Cydonia. The connection here was determined not by simple observation and supposition, but was founded in the solid facts of geometry. The question was, what if the ancient ruins in England corresponded in size, shape, and dimension to the features on the plain of Cydonia?
What if the Avebury circle was to represent the crater and Silbury was to represent the tholus, and the angles and positions of ancient features, including where the cliff would be and where the tetrahedral pyramid would be, and angles to other key things in this vicinity all seem to match, including the very size of Silbury Hill in terms of its exterior moat in reference to the tholus.
Were all of these structures built by the same race of beings, human or otherwise? And if so, does this constitute new evidence that intelligent life could have once thrived on the planet Mars?
Richard Hoagland suggests many possibilities.
One is that we had a previous high-tech civilization on Earth which developed spaceflight, went to Mars, built some stuff, and then collapsed. And we're now just rediscovering our heritage. The second hypothesis is that someone else from far out there, from the stars, thousands, hundreds of light years away, came to the solar system, came to Mars, built the stuff, and built a monument to this primitive being that would someday become a human being, the human species, here on Earth.
In either case, it would seem that some global catastrophe forced the Martian population to abandon their world and move to another, to the Earth.
And someday, we may discover, in fact, that we are the Martians after all.
Assuming for a moment that there once was a flourishing race on Mars and that they built this complex structure, one important question remains. Why?
Cydonia was probably constructed to communicate some very fundamental information. We believe now that we are looking at the outlines of a whole new physics, how the universe functions, a kind of a grand unified theory, as it were, given to us, communicated, even on the photographs taken by Viking, by the geometric layout of the structures.
Researchers now believe that the key to understanding the geometry of the DNM pyramid may be in the size, shape, and position of the massive structure. Hoagland and others point out that the pyramid is not oriented to the Martian North Pole, but is turned slightly to one side. Latitude lines show that two of the faces are out of alignment at exactly the same angle, 19 19.5 degrees.
Why 19.5? That on every major and minor planet that we have flown by, looked at, or mapped in the last 30 years through NASA imagery, the major disturbance, starting with Jupiter and the Great Red Spot, lies just about at 19.5 north or south.
The Great Red Spot on the planet Jupiter is essentially a giant cyclone, an atmospheric storm larger than the entire planet Earth. It continues to churn away for year after year, right at 19.5 degrees south. Hoagland asserts that on every planet in our solar system, there does seem to be some kind of major geological or atmospheric disturbance found at 19.5 degrees north or south, including our own gigantic volcano, Mauna Loa. Colossal power rages up from the center of the Earth, emerging in the Hawaiian Islands at 19.5 degrees north. Does this suggest that the builders of the D&M Pyramid recorded in its structure a sort of key to the inner nature of every planet in our system, including our own? According to Hoagland, the builders of the monuments at Cydonia had a reason for leaving the number 19.5 encrypted in a pyramid.
This is a four-sided, four-cornered object termed a tetrahedron. Because if you put this structure in a sphere, it predicts some remarkable phenomena.
Hoagland says that if a perfect tetrahedron or pyramid is placed inside a sphere such as a planet, so that one tip is at the north or south pole, the other tips will fall at the latitudes of 19.5 degrees north or south, the same as the angles discovered in the D&M Pyramid. Was this giant tetrahedron built on the plains of Cydonia to help future generations understand the sources of power within their own planets?
If these discoveries truly are the long-awaited proof that there once was intelligent life on another world, would it not seem reasonable that we try to get a closer look at the Cydonia region of Mars?
And in 1992, an attempt was made to do exactly that, but with strange and surprising results. The bizarre puzzle of the Mars orbiter when UFO Diaries returns.
On September 25th, 1992, one of the most sophisticated space probes of its kind was launched into outer space. The Mars Observer was designed and programmed to approach, photograph, and carefully study the red planet in far greater detail than ever before.
Then on August 21st, 1993, at precisely 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, the radio signals from the Mars Observer stopped. The Mars Observer probe, over 17 years in the making at a project cost of nearly $1 billion, had gone silent, suddenly and completely. But why? Was there a simple malfunction, or is there more to the mystery than that?
The Mars Observer mission may have been doomed before it even left the ground. Hurricane Andrew hit the coast of Florida just about the time the Mars Observer was being prepared for launch. Even though it had been prepared for such an onslaught, technicians checked the probe to make sure that it had not been damaged by the storm. The nitrogen system was equipped with special filters to prevent such dust and debris from being taken into the system, and the cameras were in a separate compartment. In spite of this, bits of paper and dust and debris was found in both compartments. It looked like someone had swept the floor and taken the dustpan and dumped it in those compartments. It's unlikely that Hurricane Andrew would have been responsible for all of that damage.
But if not the hurricane, then who? Why would anyone wish to sabotage a photographic expedition to Mars? Could this be because someone or something doesn't want us to get a closer look at our neighbor planet? And if that's true, what is the secret they're trying to protect?
There are many experts now who believe that the forces protecting a secret on Mars may not be on the red planet, but here on Earth. Since the first television cameras flew with space missions in the mid-1960s, NASA has always shared its video images with the world. But many sources report that just before the launch of the Mars Observer, NASA announced that for the first time ever, they would not allow any images sent back from Mars to be broadcast on live TV.
Why? Why would the National Space Agency suddenly change a policy that had stood for almost 40 years? Had they learned something about Mars that they wouldn't admit?
NASA has had a long, very close relationship with the Department of Defense, so they have been, I believe, under a lot of national security restrictions, and there is very much evidence, I believe, of backtracking and coyness on behalf of NASA and their involvement with UFOs.
Like all government projects, if they don't have an answer, they don't want to be embarrassed, so they keep everything secret until they know more about it.
The Mars Observer might have given us definitive answers to the question of intelligent life on Mars, and it might not have. But as of now, the Mars Observer appears to be lost somewhere in the vast reaches of space. Could it be just the latest victim of the galactic ghoul, or is there some other explanation?
Stanley McDaniel, author of the McDaniel Report, believes there is a very practical explanation.
But some people have speculated that NASA is afraid that it'll lose funding if it even so much as hints that it might imagine that there are extraterrestrial artifacts on Mars or elsewhere in the solar system. I think they believe that Congress would think this was so far-fetched that they would withdraw funds.
There are still so many questions left unanswered. Is this face just a natural formation, or was it constructed by some long-lost civilization? And what of the pyramids of Mars? Are they ancestors of the pyramids of Egypt, or just uniquely shaped piles of frozen Martian soil? Is the perfect geometric precision found in these surface features of Cydonia nothing more than a bizarre series of coincidences? Could it be that we are descendants of ancient Martians who sought refuge from their own dying world? If so, does that mean that we are the Martians we claimed we might someday meet? As scientists plan future manned missions to the Red Planet, are we on the verge of learning that Mars is not only our destination, but was also once the beginning? Is this a portrait of the being who long ago made the very first entry into the UFO diary?